You really thought I wouldn't come, Richard? The words sliced through the Connecticut afternoon like a blade through silk. Every champagne flute froze mid-air. Every conversation died. 200 guests in designer clothes turned as one toward the woman standing at the garden gate, backlit by golden sunlight that made her seem almost otherworldly. Sarah Thornton watched her ex-husband's face drain of every drop of color. Beside him, Victoria clutched his arm with white-knuckled desperation, her pregnant belly prominent beneath expensive silk. The same man who'd handed Sarah divorce papers 3 years ago, calling her defective because she couldn't give him children, now stood paralyzed as 4 toddlers tumbled from the Range Rover behind her. The babies wore matching linen outfits, their laughter piercing the stunned silence. Emma reached for her mother's hand. Thomas babbled happily. Grace and Margaret toddled forward on unsteady legs, oblivious to the shock rippling through the crowd of Connecticut elite. Richard's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble patio. Sarah Elizabeth Hartford grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, where everyone knew your name and your business. Her father, Thomas Hartford, was a carpenter whose calloused hands could transform rough lumber into intricate cabinets that graced half the homes in their neighborhood. Her mother, Ruth, spent 30 years as a nurse at the county hospital, coming home each evening smelling faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion, but always with enough energy to ask about Sarah's day. They lived in a modest ranch house with a porch that tilted slightly to the left, a result of the foundation settling over decades, something her father always promised to fix but never quite got around to. Money was tight, but love was abundant. Sunday dinners meant potluck casseroles and her mother's apple pie. Summer evenings were spent on that tilted porch, her father teaching her the names of constellations while fireflies danced in the yard. Sarah learned early that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in moments like these, in the way her parents looked at each other across the dinner table after 30 years of marriage, still finding reasons to laugh. When Sarah was 23 and finishing her undergraduate degree in biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin, her father started losing weight. At first, they dismissed it as stress from a difficult job. But when his skin took on a yellow tinge and the pain became unbearable, the diagnosis came swift and merciless. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The oncologist delivered the news in a sterile room that smelled of floor cleaner, explaining treatment options that cost more than her parents had earned in the last decade combined. Insurance covered some, but the experimental treatments that might actually help remained out of reach, priced at $10,000 per infusion. Sarah watched her father fade over 8 months. She watched him try to hide his pain so they wouldn't waste money on morphine they couldn't afford. She watched her mother work double shifts, trying to pay for treatments that only bought him weeks, not years. She held his hand the night he died, whispering promises she didn't yet know how to keep. That she would find a way to make medicine accessible. That no other daughter would have to watch her father beg for relief from pain, that his death would mean something. His funeral was held at the Lutheran church where he'd helped build the new addition. The pews were packed with people whose homes bore his craftsmanship, whose lives he'd touched with his quiet kindness. Sarah stood beside the simple pine casket he'd built himself years earlier, knowing he'd made it to save them the expense, and decided then that she would dedicate her life to cancer research. Not for glory or recognition, but because she couldn't bear the thought of another family sitting in a sterile oncology office being told that survival had a price tag they couldn't meet. She was accepted into the PhD program at Johns Hopkins University on a full scholarship 3 months later, and she never looked back at Madison. Not yet. The Medical Research Conference at the Baltimore Convention Center in October 2014 drew pharmaceutical executives from across the country, men in expensive suits who saw disease as opportunity and treatment as profit margin. Sarah Hartford stood at the podium in a dress she'd borrowed from her roommate, Her presentation slides projected behind her, showing graphs and data tables that represented 4 years of sleepless nights and borrowed lab time. The title read, Affordable Cancer Treatment Protocols, Reducing Manufacturing Costs Without Compromising Efficacy. She spoke with the passion of someone who'd watched her father die for lack of money, her voice steady despite her nervousness. She showed photographs, one of her father in his workshop surrounded by wood shavings and sunlight, another of him in a hospital bed, his skin paper-thin and yellow. "This is Thomas Hartford," she said to the room of 200 people. "He died because he couldn't afford treatment that cost $200 to manufacture but was priced at $10,000 per dose. This is why I do this work, because medicine should heal people, not bankrupt them." Most of the audience looked uncomfortable, checking their phones or whispering to colleagues. These were people who profited from the very system she was criticizing, but in the back row, one man sat completely still, his eyes fixed on her face. Richard Alexander Montgomery IV was 30 years old, impossibly handsome in a way that suggested generations of careful breeding, with dark hair and the kind of bone structure that belonged in old oil paintings. He'd attended the conference reluctantly, fulfilling his duties as a representative of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, the company his great-grandfather had founded in 1890. When Sarah finished her presentation to polite, sparse applause, she gathered her materials with shaking hands, already regretting her emotional honesty. These people didn't care about her father. They cared about quarterly earnings and shareholder dividends. She was heading toward the exit when a voice stopped her. "Dr. Hartford?" She turned to find the man from the back row approaching, and up close he was even more striking, though something in his eyes looked sad. "Richard Montgomery, your research is extraordinary." Sarah's spine straightened. "Montgomery? As in Montgomery Pharmaceuticals?" Her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Unfortunately, yes." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "But I promise, I'm here as an admirer of your work, not a corporate vulture. Your company charges $10,000 per treatment cycle for drugs that cost $200 to manufacture," Sarah said, not bothering to soften her accusation. Several nearby attendees turned to watch. Richard paused, and something flickered across his face, genuine shame, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he'd spent years avoiding. "You're absolutely right," he said quietly. "And people like you are why people like me need to do better." Sarah hadn't expected agreement. She'd expected defensiveness, corporate talking points, the usual justifications about research costs and development risks. His honesty disarmed her enough that when he asked if she'd have coffee with him to discuss her research further, she found herself saying yes, though every instinct told her to walk away from this man who represented everything she despised about the pharmaceutical industry. They met the next morning at a small cafe near the harbor, far from the conference hotels. Richard arrived before her, already seated at a corner table with 2 coffees. He'd remembered how she took hers from the previous day, black with 1 sugar, which seemed like an absurdly small detail to notice. They talked for 3 hours, and Sarah found herself explaining not just her research, but her father's death, the medical bills that had destroyed her mother's retirement savings, the way the system ground down people who couldn't afford to fight back. Richard listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or defenses. When she finally stopped talking, exhausted from the emotion of it, he told her about his own mother's death from ovarian cancer when he was 12 years old. "She needed experimental treatment," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "My father's company owned the patent. The board voted to wait for FDA approval because rushing it would have been risky for stock prices. She died 3 months before approval came through." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, meaning it. She saw in his face the same haunted look she saw in her own mirror, the expression of someone who'd watched a parent die needlessly. "I've spent my whole life trying to figure out how to change the system from inside," Richard said. "But I don't know if that's possible. Maybe it takes people like you, who see it clearly, because you're not part of it." Sarah wanted to dislike him. It would have been easier. But sitting across from this man who spoke about his dead mother with barely controlled grief, she found herself thinking that perhaps not everyone born into wealth was beyond redemption. Just 200 words. The day before their wedding, Richard's lawyer appeared at Ruth's house with a leather briefcase and an apologetic expression. Sarah was in the middle of addressing wedding invitations at the kitchen table, her hand cramped from writing the same elegant script for hours. The lawyer, a thin man in his 60s named Harold Pemberton, explained that he needed Sarah to sign some standard paperwork, just formalities required by the state of Connecticut for marriages involving significant family assets. Sarah barely glanced at the documents. She was exhausted from wedding preparations, her mind occupied with seating charts and catering questions and the 100 small details that apparently mattered for even a simple ceremony. The papers looked official, filled with dense legal language that made her eyes glaze over. Harold pointed to signature lines, explaining each as standard boilerplate and typical liability protection. There was one about separate property acquired before marriage, another about debt responsibility, a third about estate planning. Sarah signed each one, trusting that Richard wouldn't ask her to sign anything harmful. What she didn't see, buried in paragraph 17 of page 23, was a clause that read, "Any intellectual property, including but not limited to patents, research, publications, or discoveries developed during the period of cohabitation and marriage, shall be considered joint marital property subject to equitable division in the event of dissolution." The language was deliberately obscure, designed to be overlooked, and Sarah overlooked it completely. Their honeymoon was 2 weeks in a rental cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, Sarah's choice because she wanted simplicity and nature, not exotic beaches or European cities. They hiked during the days, cooked simple meals together in the evenings, made love in a bed that creaked with every movement. Richard seemed lighter there, younger somehow, laughing more easily than Sarah had ever heard. On their last night they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I wish we could stay here forever," Richard said, and there was something desperate in his voice that made Sarah turn to look at him. "We'll come back," she promised. "Every year we'll come back to this exact cabin." "Will we?" Richard's smile was sad. "Or will life get in the way? Obligations, expectations, all the things waiting for us back in the real world." "Then we'll make this our real world," Sarah said firmly. "We'll choose this, choose each other, no matter what's waiting out there." Richard kissed her forehead, but didn't answer, and Sarah felt the first cold whisper of doubt. But she pushed it away because they were happy, weren't they? This was what love looked like. She was sure of it. Reality arrived the day they returned to Connecticut. The Montgomery estate sprawled across 15 acres in Greenwich, a limestone mansion with 40 rooms, formal gardens, and a staff of 15 people who moved through the halls like ghosts, always present but never acknowledged. Sarah had seen photographs, but nothing prepared her for the actual scale of wealth on display. The chandelier in the entrance hall cost more than her parents' entire house. The cars in the garage, each one worth 6 figures, outnumbered the bedrooms she'd lived in throughout her childhood. Eleanor Montgomery waited in the formal sitting room, a woman of 78 with silver hair arranged in a perfect chignon, wearing a pale blue suit that probably cost more than Sarah's student loan debt. She didn't stand when they entered, didn't offer any greeting warmer than a slight inclination of her head. "So?" she said, her voice carrying the crisp consonants of old Connecticut money. "You're the girl. Not young woman, not Richard's wife, just the girl, as if Sarah were too insignificant to warrant a noun that acknowledged her personhood. The first dinner at the Montgomery estate was an exercise in quiet cruelty. They sat at a table that could seat 20, just the three of them, served by silent staff who appeared and disappeared like conjurers. Eleanor asked pointed questions designed to expose Sarah's inadequacies. "And what do your people do, dear?" The word people carried the weight of centuries of class distinction. "My mother was a nurse," Sarah answered, keeping her voice steady. "She retired last year after 30 years at County General. My father was a carpenter before he passed." "Was?" Eleanor's perfectly penciled eyebrow arched. "And he was in trade, I assume?" "He built things," Sarah said quietly. "Beautiful things. Cabinets and furniture that people will use for generations. He made things that lasted." "How rustic," Eleanor said, and the word carried more contempt than Sarah thought possible to pack into 3 syllables. The silence that followed felt like ice water down her spine. Richard sat between them, cutting his duck breast into precise pieces, saying nothing. Sarah waited for him to defend her, to say something, anything that would indicate he found his grandmother's behavior inappropriate. But he simply ate in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his plate. Later that night, in the guest room they'd been assigned, because apparently Richard's childhood bedroom wasn't suitable for a married couple, Sarah confronted him. "Why didn't you say anything? What was I supposed to say?" Richard loosened his tie, not meeting her eyes. "That she was being cruel, that she was being unbelievably rude to your wife. That her behavior was unacceptable." Sarah's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm. "She's from a different generation, Sarah. She doesn't understand." "She understands perfectly. She was deliberately trying to make me feel small, and you let her." Richard finally looked at her, and she saw exhaustion in his face, the weariness of someone who'd fought this battle too many times to believe he could win. "If I challenge her, she'll make things worse. For both of us. It's better to just ignore it, let her comments roll off." "Better for whom?" Sarah asked. "Because it's not better for me, Richard. I'm your wife. You're supposed to stand up for me." "I know," he said quietly. "You're right. I should have. I'm sorry. I'll do better." But he didn't do better. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's comments grew sharper, more personal. She critiqued Sarah's clothes, her posture, her conversation, the way she held her fork. She offered to help Sarah adjust to proper society, providing supplements and vitamins that would give her more energy for the exhausting social calendar. "You'll need them, dear," Eleanor said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The demands of this life can be quite draining for those not accustomed to it." Sarah, trying desperately to build some kind of relationship with Richard's only family, accepted the pills gratefully. They came in bottles bearing the Montgomery Pharmaceuticals logo, and Eleanor explained they were specially formulated supplements not available to the general public, a perk of family ownership. What Sarah didn't know was that she'd just accepted the first dose of the poison that would steal 3 years of her life. 2,000 words. By December 2016, the pressure to produce an heir had become the central focus of every family gathering. Christmas dinner at the Montgomery estate was an ordeal of pointed questions and thinly veiled criticisms. Richard's Uncle Harold, a board member who'd made his fortune in commercial real estate, raised his wine glass and announced loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "So, Richard, when can we expect the pitter-patter of little feet? The Montgomery line doesn't perpetuate itself, you know." Richard's cousin, Margaret, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, who'd produced 3 children in efficient succession, leaned across the table with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tick-tock, Sarah dear. Biology waits for no woman. You're what, 30 now? The clock is rather loud, isn't it?" Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation. She stared at her barely touched plate of duck and wanted to disappear. Around the table, 15 members of the Montgomery family waited for her response, vultures circling wounded prey. She opened her mouth, not knowing what she would say, but Richard spoke first. "We're working on it," he said curtly, and took a long drink of wine. It wasn't a defense of Sarah, wasn't a rebuke of their rudeness. It was a capitulation, an agreement that yes, they were failing at their primary duty, which was apparently to produce the next generation of Montgomery heirs. That night, lying in bed in the guest room that still didn't feel like home after 18 months of marriage, Richard rolled toward her. "Maybe we should start trying," he said. "For real. Track your cycles, time things properly. Make them happy." Sarah wanted to say that making love shouldn't be about making other people happy, that creating a child should come from desire and readiness, not family pressure. But she also wanted to please him, wanted to prove to these cold, cruel people that she belonged, that she was worthy of the Montgomery name. So she agreed. In January 2017, Sarah stopped taking birth control and began taking the supplements Eleanor had been providing for over a year. She bought ovulation predictor kits and began tracking her cycle with scientific precision. Richard approached their attempts at conception with the same analytical focus he brought to board meetings, consulting apps that told them optimal timing, best positions, ideal frequency. Sex became scheduled, mechanical, stripped of joy or spontaneity. Month after month, Sarah's period arrived like clockwork, and each time felt like a personal failure. She would lock herself in the bathroom, staring at the blood that meant another month of disappointment, another month of Richard's barely concealed frustration, another month of Eleanor's knowing looks. By June, Sarah had started to believe something was fundamentally wrong with her body, that she was broken in some essential way. "We should see a doctor," Richard said one night after another failed attempt. His tone suggested he was discussing a malfunctioning appliance that needed repair. Dr. Patricia Chen was a renowned fertility specialist whose office overlooked Baltimore's Inner Harbor. She was efficient and kind, explaining the testing process with practiced patience. Sarah underwent blood work, ultrasounds, hormone panels, every test designed to identify what was preventing conception. When the results came back, Dr. Chen looked genuinely confused. "Sarah, your tests are completely normal," she said, reviewing the paperwork. "Your hormone levels are excellent. Your ovarian reserve is actually above average for your age. Your tubes are clear. There's no medical reason you shouldn't be conceiving naturally." "Then why isn't it happening?" Sarah asked, and heard the desperation in her own voice. "Sometimes these things take time. Stress can be a factor, and I can see from your history that you've been under considerable pressure. But medically speaking, there's nothing wrong." Dr. Chen paused. "I'd like to test your husband as well. About 40% of fertility issues involve male factors." Richard refused. He sat in the consultation room with his arms crossed, his face set in the stubborn expression Sarah had learned to dread. "It's not me," he said flatly. "My family has no history of fertility issues. The Montgomery men have been producing heirs for 4 generations without difficulty." "Mr. Montgomery, with all due respect, family history doesn't guarantee individual fertility," Dr. Chen said gently. "A simple semen analysis could rule out—" "I said no." Richard stood. "We'll try fertility medications for Sarah. That should solve the problem." Dr. Chen looked at Sarah with sympathy, but prescribed the medications Richard requested. Sarah began taking Clomid, a drug designed to stimulate ovulation, even though she was already ovulating normally. The medication made her sick, gave her mood swings that left her crying over nothing, headaches that felt like her skull was splitting. Richard had no patience for these side effects. "You're being emotional again," he'd say when he found her crying. "The stress is probably why you're not getting pregnant. You need to calm down." But Sarah was taking 3 different medications now: Eleanor's supplements, the Clomid prescribed by Dr. Chen, and additional vitamins Richard insisted she needed for optimal fertility. Her body felt like a chemistry experiment, pumped full of substances that made her feel disconnected from herself. By September 2017, Sarah had made a decision that would haunt her for years. Johns Hopkins called to tell her that her cancer research was ready for clinical trials, that the next phase would require her presence in the lab 40 to 50 hours per week. It was the culmination of 6 years of work, the realization of the promise she'd made to her dying father. But when she told Richard, his response was immediate and unequivocal. "You can't do both," he said. They were having dinner at the estate, just the 2 of them for once, and Sarah had thought he might be pleased, might see this as the success it was. "You need to choose, your research or our family." "Why can't I have both?" Sarah asked. "Plenty of women have careers and children." "Plenty of women aren't Montgomery wives," Richard said, and his tone had taken on the clipped precision his grandmother used when discussing proper behavior. "The expectations are different. The demands are different." "My mother never worked outside the home. It's simply not done." "Your mother died when you were 12, Sarah said quietly. "You don't actually know what she would have done if she'd lived." Richard's face hardened. "Don't talk about my mother." The pressure came from all sides. Eleanor mentioned at every opportunity how devoted Richard's mother had been to family, how she'd understood that a Montgomery wife's first duty was to home and heritage. Richard's uncle suggested that Sarah's career obsession was probably why she couldn't conceive, that stress from trying to compete in a man's world was damaging her fertility. Even the family doctor, who'd been seeing the Montgomerys for 30 years, suggested that Sarah should focus on natural feminine pursuits rather than laboratory work. Worn down, desperate to save her marriage, terrified that she was indeed the problem, Sarah called her research team at Johns Hopkins and withdrew from the project. Her mentor, Dr. Harold Winston, was devastated. "Sarah, this is your life's work," he said over the phone, and she could hear the disbelief in his voice. "We're so close. Clinical trials could start within months. You can't just walk away." "I have to," Sarah said, and she was crying, had been crying so much lately that her eyes felt permanently raw. "I have to choose my marriage." "This isn't choosing your marriage," Dr. Winston said gently. "This is choosing to erase yourself. Sarah, I've known you for 6 years. This research, this passion for helping people, it's who you are. Don't let someone take that from you." But Sarah had already made the decision. She officially withdrew from the research program, signed over her work to the remaining team members, packed up her office at Johns Hopkins. Richard seemed pleased, or at least relieved, which Sarah mistook for approval. What she didn't know was that 3 weeks after she signed the withdrawal papers, Richard filed patent applications for her research through Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, using the prenuptial clause that made her intellectual property joint marital assets. The year 2018 brought new depths of desperation. Sarah's life had narrowed to a single purpose: getting pregnant. She took her temperature every morning before getting out of bed, recorded every symptom in a detailed journal, timed intercourse to the hour based on ovulation predictions. Richard had become increasingly distant, working late most nights, taking business trips that seemed to multiply. When he was home, he was irritable, short-tempered, treating Sarah more like an inconvenient obligation than a wife he'd once claimed to love. Eleanor's comments had evolved from veiled suggestions to open cruelty. "Perhaps you're simply not meant to be a mother," she said one afternoon while they were having tea in the conservatory, a weekly ritual Sarah endured because Richard insisted she try to build a relationship with his grandmother. "Some women are constitutionally unsuited for motherhood. It's nature's way of protecting children from inadequate mothers." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. but refused to let them fall in front of this woman. "The doctors say there's nothing wrong with me," she said quietly. "Doctors say many things," Eleanor replied, stirring her tea with deliberate precision. "But results speak louder than medical opinions, don't they? 2 years of trying and nothing. Perhaps your body is trying to tell you something, dear." What Sarah didn't know was that Eleanor's supplements, the ones she'd been taking faithfully for 2 years, weren't supplements at all. They were hormone suppressants, industrial-grade blockers, typically used to prevent pregnancy in cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals manufactured them, and Eleanor had access to the entire catalog. She'd been systematically sterilizing Sarah since the wedding, ensuring that no child of working-class blood would dilute the precious Montgomery lineage. 1,500 words. In February 2019, Sarah found a credit card statement that Richard had left on his desk in the home office. She hadn't been snooping, had only gone in to borrow a pen. But the paper caught her eye because of the amount. $45,000 charged to Cartier Jewelers in Manhattan. Her heart began to race. Richard had given her nothing for Christmas, except a perfunctory kiss and a card with his signature, but no message. Her birthday had passed in January without acknowledgement. So who had received $45,000 worth of jewelry? When Richard came home that evening, Sarah was waiting in the living room, the statement in her hands. "Who is she?" she asked without preamble. Richard's face went carefully blank. The expression she'd learned meant he was calculating his response. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The jewelry, $45,000. "I didn't receive it, so who did?" "It was a business gift," Richard said, moving past her toward the bar to pour himself a scotch. "A client. It's standard practice." "Don't lie to me, Richard. I may have given up my career, my research, my entire identity to be your wife, but I'm not stupid. Business gifts don't cost $45,000. "You wouldn't understand the complexity of business relationships," Richard said, and his tone was condescending in a way that made Sarah's hands clench. "Sometimes, significant investments are necessary to maintain important connections." Sarah wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to believe him, because the alternative meant that her marriage was not just dying, but already dead, that she'd sacrificed everything for a man who was betraying her. But she knew in her bones that he was lying. March brought a new revelation, this one accidental. Sarah mentioned Eleanor's supplements to her mother during their weekly phone call, and Ruth's response was immediate and sharp. "What supplements? You never took vitamins before you were married. You always said they were a waste of money." Sarah looked at the bottles lined up on her bathroom counter, all bearing the Montgomery Pharmaceuticals logo. "Eleanor gives them to me. She says they'll help with fertility, give me energy for the social calendar." "Sarah, honey, what are they called? Read me the names." Sarah read the long pharmaceutical names, stumbling over the pronunciation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Ruth spoke again, her voice was tight with controlled anger. "Sarah, I need you to look those up, right now. While I'm on the phone with you, Google those exact names." With growing dread, Sarah opened her laptop and typed in the first medication name. The results made her stomach drop. Hormone suppressant, used primarily in cancer patients to prevent pregnancy during chemotherapy. Known side effects: mood swings, fatigue, depression, complete suppression of fertility. She checked the second medication. The same. The third. All of them hormone suppressants. Contraceptives disguised as vitamins. Poison wrapped in the promise of help. "Mom," Sarah whispered, and her voice was shaking so badly she could barely form words. "Mom, what has she done to me?" "Stop taking them immediately," Ruth said, and Sarah could hear her mother was crying. "Stop taking them right now, do you hear me? And Sarah, you need to get out of that house. You need to come home." Sarah stopped taking the medications that day, but the damage had been done. 2 years of systematic poisoning had stolen 2 years of her fertility, 2 years of her life. She made an appointment with her family doctor in Wisconsin, driving there alone because she couldn't tell Richard, not yet, not until she understood the full scope of what had been done to her. Dr. Robert Morrison had delivered Sarah, had been her pediatrician, had known her father. He was 70 now, semi-retired, but he agreed to see her immediately when she called. The tests he ran told a story that made Sarah physically ill. The hormone suppressants were still in her system, would take months to fully clear, but more devastating was the discovery written in her old medical records, a notation from 3 years earlier that Dr. Morrison explained with tears in his own eyes. Sarah, according to these tests from your previous doctor in Baltimore, you were pregnant 3 years ago, about 6 weeks along. The medications you were taking, the hormone suppressants, they would have caused early miscarriage. You wouldn't have known. It would have seemed like a heavy period. Sarah couldn't breathe. She'd lost a baby she never knew she'd been carrying, killed by medications given to her by her husband's grandmother, taken faithfully because she'd trusted them, because she'd been trying so hard to do everything right. "Can I still have children?" she asked, and her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Dr. Morrison took her hand. "Yes, Sarah, you're remarkably healthy. Your natural fertility is actually above average. Once these medications clear your system completely, you should have no trouble conceiving naturally. You were never infertile, Sarah. Someone was deliberately preventing you from getting pregnant." The confrontation happened in May, 3 months after Sarah had stopped taking Eleanor's medications. She'd been gathering evidence, documenting everything, consulting with lawyers about her options. When she finally had irrefutable proof, she laid it all out on the dining room table, the medication bottles, the research about their true purpose, Dr. Morrison's statement, her own medical record showing the pregnancy she'd lost. Richard came home to find her waiting, the evidence spread before her like an indictment. Eleanor was there too. Sarah had insisted she come, had told her it was urgent family business. "What are these?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the rage and grief churning inside her. Eleanor glanced at the bottles. "Your supplements, dear." "Why?" "Try again. What are they really?" Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, a calculation, a decision. "They're what was necessary." Richard picked up one of the bottles, reading the label. "Grandmother, what is she talking about?" "She's talking about the fact that your grandmother has been sterilizing me for 2 years, Sarah said, and watched Richard's face go pale. "These aren't supplements. They're hormone suppressants, contraceptives. She's been preventing me from getting pregnant while letting me believe I was infertile, while letting everyone believe I was broken." "Grandmother," Richard said, and there was something in his voice Sarah had never heard before, horror mixed with dawning comprehension. "Tell me this isn't true." Eleanor lifted her chin, defiant. "I did what you were too weak to do. I protected this family from contamination. I wasn't going to stand by and watch you pollute the Montgomery bloodline with working-class genes. Your mother did enough damage marrying your father. I wasn't going to let history repeat itself." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah waited for Richard to explode, to defend her, to show some outrage at what his grandmother had done. But Richard just stood there, the bottle in his hands, his face white with shock, but his mouth firmly closed. "Say something," Sarah said to him. "Your grandmother has been poisoning me for 2 years. She killed our baby. Say something, Richard." "I need time to think," Richard said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Time to think?" Sarah's voice rose, all her controlled fury breaking free. "Your grandmother has been committing assault, Richard. Medical assault. She's been systematically destroying my body's ability to function normally. And you need time to think?" "I didn't know about this," Richard said. But he still wasn't looking at her. "I need to process this. I need to understand." "Understand what?" Whether poisoning your wife is acceptable as long as it protects the precious Montgomery name? Sarah was shaking now, tears streaming down her face. Say something that matters, Richard. Defend me. Choose me. For once in our marriage, choose me over this toxic family and their twisted legacy. But Richard said nothing. He set down the bottle, looked from his grandmother to his wife, and walked out of the room. Sarah heard his car start in the driveway moments later, heard the crunch of gravel as he drove away, leaving her alone with the woman who'd tried to destroy her. Eleanor looked at Sarah with something almost like pity. You never understood, did you? Richard was never going to choose you. Men like Richard don't choose their wives over their inheritance. That's not how our world works. 3 days later, Richard moved out of the house, telling Sarah he needed space to think, that the situation was complicated, that he needed time to process. He went to stay at his brother's house in Stamford, or so he claimed. In reality, he moved into an apartment that belonged to Victoria Ashford, a woman from an old Boston family, someone Eleanor had introduced him to 6 months earlier at a charity gala. Sarah stayed in the mansion alone, rattling around in 40 rooms that had never felt like home. 1,200 words. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in August 2019, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be handing Sarah documents that would officially end her marriage. She signed for them with hands that had stopped shaking weeks ago, past the point of shock, living now in a numb space where nothing could hurt her anymore because she'd already lost everything that mattered. The settlement Richard's lawyers proposed was devastating in its precision. The house remained his because he'd purchased it before the marriage. The cars stayed with him because the titles were in his name alone. Their joint savings account, which contained 8 years of accumulated wealth, would be split according to contribution percentages, which the lawyers calculated meant Richard kept 92%, since he'd earned the majority of their income. Sarah would receive $50,000, barely enough for a security deposit on a decent apartment and a few months of living expenses. And the prenuptial agreement she'd signed so carelessly the day before their wedding turned out to be ironclad. Sarah hired a lawyer, a tired woman named Patricia Morrison, who specialized in divorce cases and had seen every trick wealthy men used to abandon their wives with nothing. Patricia reviewed the documents and delivered the news with practiced sympathy. I'm sorry, Sarah. The prenup is legally sound. Since you were married less than 10 years and most assets were his before marriage, you're looking at a very modest settlement, maybe enough for 6 months of living expenses if you're careful. What about my research? Sarah asked. The cancer treatment I was developing before we married. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals released it last year. They're making millions from it. Patricia flipped through the pages, her expression growing grimmer. There's a clause here about intellectual property developed during cohabitation becoming marital assets. Did you work on this research during your marriage? I gave up working on it actively, but yes, all the foundational work was done while we were married. That's my life's work, my father's legacy. Then legally it became joint marital property the moment you married, and in the division of assets, intellectual property rights would have gone to whoever had the means to commercialize them. I'm sorry, Sarah. Your husband essentially stole your research legally. You signed away your rights without knowing it. Sarah sat in Patricia's office, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and felt the last piece of her old life crumble. Richard hadn't just left her. He'd systematically dismantled everything she was, taken her research, her home, her financial security, even her sense of reality itself. And he'd done it all legally, with documents she'd signed herself. She moved out of the mansion in September with a single suitcase containing her clothes and a few books. The staff, who'd been kind to her in ways the family never was, cried as she left. The housekeeper pressed an envelope into her hands. Inside was $3,000 in cash. We all pitched in, Maria whispered. We know what they did to you. It's not much, but it's something." Sarah cried then, the first tears she'd shed in weeks, because these people who earned minimum wage had shown her more kindness than a family worth hundreds of millions. She found a studio apartment in Baltimore for $800 a month, a tiny space with a Murphy bed and a hot plate that passed for a kitchen. Her mother begged her to come home to Wisconsin, but Sarah couldn't face the pity in everyone's eyes, couldn't bear to return to Madison as the girl who'd tried to marry above her station and been destroyed for her presumption. She applied for jobs throughout October and November, but her resume told a story that made potential employers wary. PhD program abandoned, 8 years of research given up, no recent work experience, a gap that screamed rich housewife who decided to dabble in employment. She was overqualified for entry-level positions but underqualified for anything else, having been out of her field too long. Eventually, she found work as a substitute teacher, earning $90 a day when she was called in, which was maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Some months she couldn't make rent. She ate ramen and eggs, had stopped buying coffee, walked everywhere to save on bus fare. At 35 years old, she was starting over with less than she'd had at 22. The worst discovery came in December when she visited the free clinic because she couldn't afford her usual doctor. The physician's assistant, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, ran routine blood work and called Sarah back in with results that made the room spin. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about your medical history. According to records from your previous doctor in Baltimore, you were pregnant approximately 3 years ago, about 6 weeks gestation. But the medications you were taking at the time, the hormone suppressants, they would have caused spontaneous termination. The bleeding would have seemed like a heavy period." Sarah stared at the wall behind Dr. Martinez, unable to process the words. "I was pregnant?" "Yes. I'm so very sorry. But Sarah, there's good news. Your current tests show you're completely healthy. Your fertility is actually excellent, better than average for your age. Once those medications cleared your system, your body returned to normal function. When you're ready, when you find the right partner, you should have no trouble conceiving naturally." Sarah drove back to her studio apartment in her 15-year-old Honda that might not pass inspection next month and sat on the floor because she couldn't afford furniture yet. She'd lost a baby she never knew existed. She'd lost her research, her marriage, her home, her future. She'd lost 8 years of her life to a man who'd seen her as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, disposable the moment she failed to serve his purposes. That night, Sarah sat on the bathroom floor with a bottle of sleeping pills she'd been prescribed months ago for insomnia. The apartment was cold because she kept the heat turned down to save money. She could hear her neighbors arguing through the thin walls, their voices raw with their own desperation. She looked at the pills and thought about how easy it would be to just stop, to end the relentless pain of existing in a world where she'd been systematically erased. Her phone rang, her mother's name on the screen. Sarah stared at it, let it ring 4 times, 5. On the 6th ring, she answered, "Hi, Mom. Yeah, I'm okay." "I'm coming home." The decision to live, Sarah would realize later, was the first time in 3 years she'd made a choice purely for herself. Not for Richard, not for his family, not to prove anything to anyone. She chose to live because somewhere under the rubble of who she'd been, there was still a woman who deserved a chance to find out who she could become. 2,500 words. Sarah returned to Madison in December 2019, moving back into her childhood bedroom in her mother's small ranch house. The room hadn't changed much since she'd left for college 13 years earlier. The same faded wallpaper with tiny flowers, the same twin bed with the handmade quilt her grandmother had stitched. Ruth didn't ask questions, didn't push for details Sarah wasn't ready to share. She simply held her daughter while Sarah cried for the first time since the divorce papers had arrived, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beneath her bones. The Madison. Sarah returned to felt both familiar and foreign. She'd left as an ambitious young woman with dreams of changing the world, and she'd come back as someone who didn't recognize herself anymore. She took a job as a teacher's aide at Lincoln Elementary School, earning $28,000 a year, barely enough to cover her student loan payments and the modest rent her mother insisted she pay to maintain some sense of independence. On a January evening, Ruth insisted Sarah attend the women's support group at their church. "I don't want to talk about it," Sarah said, curled on the couch in sweatpants she'd worn for 3 days straight. "Then don't talk," Ruth said gently. "Just listen." The support group met in the church basement on Wednesday evenings, 8 women sitting in a circle of folding chairs with terrible coffee and store-brand cookies. Sarah wanted to leave the moment she walked in, but something in the way these women looked at her, with recognition rather than pity, made her stay. The women ranged in age from 45 to 75, and their stories were variations on a theme Sarah was beginning to understand too well. Margaret, 68, had lost her children in a custody battle to a wealthy ex-husband 30 years ago, and had spent decades rebuilding her life. Patricia, 52, had been financially abused for 20 years before finding the courage to leave with nothing but her clothes. Dorothy, 71, had watched her husband gamble away their retirement before abandoning her for a younger woman. When it was Sarah's turn to share, she found herself speaking words she hadn't planned to say. "My husband's grandmother poisoned me for 2 years to prevent me from getting pregnant. My husband stole my life's work and made millions from it, and the worst part is, I let them. I signed every paper they put in front of me. I gave up everything I was because I thought that's what love required." Margaret spoke first, her voice steady with hard-won wisdom. "Honey, you didn't let them do anything. You were manipulated by people who had more power, more money, and more experience in cruelty than you could have imagined. That's not your fault. That's theirs." Over the following months, Sarah began to heal in ways she hadn't known were possible. She learned that recovery wasn't linear, that some days she'd feel strong and purposeful, and other days she'd cry in the shower and wonder why she'd bothered to survive. Both were acceptable. Both were part of becoming whole again. In March 2020, Sarah was browsing the internet late one night, unable to sleep, when she found an article that made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped her laptop. The headline read, "Montgomery Pharmaceuticals releases revolutionary cancer treatment." The drug being described was her research, her father's legacy, the work she'd abandoned to save a marriage that had already been dead. The article praised Richard Montgomery as the lead researcher, crediting him with breakthrough innovation that would save thousands of lives. The cost per treatment, $12,000. Sarah had designed her research to be open source, freely available to anyone who needed it. She'd spent 6 years developing protocols that would make cancer treatment affordable for people like her father. And Richard had taken it, patented it, and turned it into exactly the kind of profit-driven medicine she'd devoted her life to fighting against. She called Patricia Morrison, her divorce attorney, at 8 the next morning. "Can they do this? Can they steal my research and make money from it?" Patricia's sigh told Sarah everything she needed to know before the lawyer spoke. "The prenup you signed included intellectual property clauses. Anything developed during your marriage became marital property. In the asset division, intellectual property rights went to whoever could commercialize them. I'm sorry, Sarah. It's legal theft, but it's still legal." Sarah sat at her mother's kitchen table after the phone call, staring at the article on her laptop screen, and felt something shift inside her. Not despair this time, but rage. Clean, clarifying rage that burned away the fog of depression she'd been living in for months. They'd taken everything from her, stripped her down to nothing, and used her own work to profit from the kind of suffering that had killed her father. That afternoon, Sarah wrote an email to her old research mentor at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Harold Winston. She explained what had happened, apologized for abandoning the work, and asked if there was any way to create a generic version of the treatment that wouldn't infringe on Montgomery's patent. Dr. Winston's response came within hours. "Sarah, I've been waiting for you to come back to yourself. Let's talk." They spoke for 3 hours on the phone, Dr. Winston walking Sarah through the possibility of developing a new approach to the same problem, using different methodology that would produce similar results without violating patent law. It would take years, he warned, and significant funding. But Sarah, if anyone can do this, it's you. You're the one who understood the fundamental problem in the first place. "I don't have funding," Sarah said. "I don't even have a lab." "Let me make some calls," Dr. Winston said. "Your story, what happened to you, there are people who would want to help, not out of pity, but because what Montgomery did was unconscionable, and there are still people in this world who believe medicine should serve humanity, not profit margins." The next evening there was a knock on Ruth's door. Sarah answered it to find a man in his early 40s, casually dressed in jeans and a sweater, with kind eyes and an easy smile that suggested he laughed often. "Dr. Hartford, I'm James William Thornton. I was hoping we could talk." Sarah was immediately wary. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." "I'm not selling anything," James said. "I'm buying, or rather, investing. May I come in?" They sat at Ruth's kitchen table, Ruth hovering protectively nearby, while James explained who he was. A tech entrepreneur from Wisconsin originally, he'd built a company creating affordable medical devices, sold it to Google for $200 million, and now worked as a venture capitalist focusing exclusively on projects that made healthcare more accessible. "I read about what happened to you," James said. And there was no pity in his voice, only anger on her behalf. "What Montgomery did, stealing your research, it's legal, but it's evil. And I want to help you fight back. Not through courts or lawyers, but by doing what you do best, creating medicine that saves lives without destroying them financially." Sarah studied his face, looking for the catch, the angle, the hidden agenda. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "My mother died of breast cancer 5 years ago," James said quietly. "She was in a clinical trial for a drug that Montgomery Pharmaceuticals owned. The drug was failing, but they kept patients in the trial for 6 months longer than they should have because pulling it early would have tanked their stock price. My mother died 3 months before they finally admitted the drug didn't work. She could have tried other treatments in that time, but instead she was a guinea pig for their profit margins." The pain in his voice was raw and real, and Sarah recognized it because she carried the same pain. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't want sympathy," James said. "I want justice, or maybe revenge. I'm not noble enough to pretend otherwise. I want to create something that makes Montgomery's greed irrelevant, that proves medicine can be both effective and affordable. And I want to do it with you, because you understand both the science and the cost of failure in ways most researchers never will." They talked until midnight, James laying out a 5-year plan that seemed simultaneously ambitious and achievable. He would fund everything: lab space, research team, equipment, clinical trials, all of it. The only condition was that any resulting treatment would be patented as open source, free for anyone to manufacture and distribute. "What do you get out of this?" Sarah asked. "I get to watch Richard Montgomery's face when he realizes you didn't stay destroyed," James said, and his smile was sharp. "I get to know my mother's death meant something. And maybe, if we do this right, I get to help create a world where fathers like yours and mothers like mine don't have to die because they can't afford medicine." 2,500 words. By June 2020, Sarah was working in a small biotech laboratory James had purchased on the outskirts of Madison. The facility wasn't impressive by pharmaceutical standards, just 6,000 square feet of lab space with aging equipment that James systematically upgraded, but to Sarah it felt like coming home. She assembled a team of 6 researchers, most of them young scientists frustrated by the profit-driven model of corporate pharmaceutical research, all of them eager to work on something that mattered more than quarterly earnings. James was present more than Sarah had expected, bringing coffee every morning, sitting in on team meetings, asking questions that revealed a sharp mind hidden behind his casual demeanor. He never interfered with the science, trusting Sarah's expertise completely, but he understood the business side in ways that protected them from the mistakes that sank most research startups. "How do you take your coffee?" he asked one morning in September, and Sarah realized he'd been bringing her coffee for 3 months without ever asking her preference. "Black with 1 sugar," she said. "How did you know?" "I pay attention," James said simply, and something in the way he looked at her made Sarah's heart skip in a way she'd thought was broken beyond repair. They fell into an easy friendship that felt natural despite Sarah's wariness about trusting anyone, especially someone with wealth and power. But James was different from Richard in every way that mattered. He asked Sarah's opinion and actually listened to her answers. He treated her team with respect, learning everyone's names and remembering details about their lives. He was quick to laugh, especially at himself, and he never made Sarah feel small or inadequate, or like she should be grateful for his attention. One evening in December, they were the last ones in the lab. Sarah was hunched over a microscope, so absorbed in examining cell cultures that she didn't hear James approach until he spoke. "Sarah, it's almost midnight. When's the last time you ate?" She blinked up at him, disoriented. "I had lunch, I think." "That was 14 hours ago." James held up a bag from the Thai restaurant down the street. "Come on, take a break. The cells will still be there in the morning." They sat in the small break room, eating pad thai from containers while Sarah explained the breakthrough she'd achieved that day. James listened with genuine interest, asking questions that proved he'd been educating himself about cancer research, learning the terminology so he could understand what she was building. "Can I ask you something personal?" James said when they'd finished eating. Sarah tensed, old habits of self-protection kicking in. "I guess. Do you regret it, the years with Richard?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret trusting him. I regret sacrificing my work for his approval. I regret not seeing what he was until it was too late. But I don't regret who I was when I loved him. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," James said. "You're not angry you loved. You're angry he wasn't worthy of it." "Exactly." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, the relief of being understood without having to explain. "How did you know that?" "Because I felt the same way about my wife," James said quietly. "Rebecca died 5 years ago. Breast cancer. And for a long time I was angry at myself for loving her, because loving her meant watching her die. But eventually I realized the love wasn't the mistake. The system that let her die, that was the mistake." Sarah hadn't known James had been married, hadn't known about this grief he carried. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it deeply. "Don't be. Or be sorry that she died. But don't be sorry that I loved her. She was remarkable, funny, brilliant, stubborn as hell." A middle school art teacher who believed every kid deserved to see beauty in the world, even the ones everyone else had given up on. James smiled at the memory, sad but genuine. "She would have liked you. She always appreciated people who fought for things bigger than themselves." "Would have," Sarah said softly. Past tense. Do you think we ever stop using past tense for the people we lose? "No," James said, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe carrying them in past tense is how we honor that they were real, that they mattered, that loving them changed who we became." Something shifted between them that night, a deepening of connection that terrified Sarah even as it drew her in. She'd sworn off men, especially wealthy men, especially men who seemed too good to be true. But James kept showing up, kept being exactly who he appeared to be, kind, patient, genuinely interested in her as a person rather than as someone who could give him something he wanted. In May 2021, James asked Sarah to dinner, not at the lab or a casual lunch spot, but a real restaurant, and he used the word date. Sarah's first instinct was to say no, to protect herself from the possibility of being hurt again. But she was tired of living in fear, tired of letting Richard's cruelty define her capacity for trust. The restaurant James chose was perfect. A small Italian place owned by a family who'd immigrated from Sicily 30 years ago, where the food was excellent but unpretentious. They talked for hours, moving past their shared professional interests into personal territory. James told her about growing up in a trailer park after his father died in a mining accident, about his mother cleaning houses for wealthy families who treated her like she was invisible, about the chip on his shoulder that had driven him to succeed. "I used to think money would make me feel safe," James said. "Like if I just had enough of it, I could protect myself and everyone I loved from ever being powerless again. But money didn't save Rebecca. It just meant she died in a nicer hospital room." "What does make you feel safe?" Sarah asked. James looked at her directly, his eyes honest in the candlelight. "This, doing work that matters, being around people who see the world the way I do. You, specifically. You make me feel safe because you already saw the worst of what wealth and power can do. I don't have to pretend with you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "James, I don't know if I can do this. The last time I let someone in, it destroyed me." "I know," James said gently, "and I'm not asking you to let me in all the way. I'm just asking you to let me stand at the door. However long it takes for you to decide if you want to open it, I'll wait." They dated slowly, carefully, James respecting every boundary Sarah set. He never pressured her for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel guilty for her caution, never compared her to Rebecca or made her feel like she was competing with a ghost. When Sarah had panic attacks about trusting again, James held her and told her that healing wasn't linear, that she was allowed to be scared and brave at the same time. 6 months into their relationship, Sarah finally told James she loved him. They were in the lab late one evening, both exhausted from a long day, when James made a terrible joke about cellular reproduction, and Sarah laughed so hard she couldn't breathe. In that moment, looking at this man who made her laugh and feel safe and believe in her own capability again, she realized the truth she'd been avoiding. "I love you," she said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating. James stopped mid-sentence, his expression shifting from surprise to joy so pure it made Sarah's chest ache. "I love you too," he said. "I've loved you since that first coffee meeting when you told me my 5-year plan was optimistically delusional and handed me a better one." In December 2021, James proposed. Not at a fancy restaurant or with an elaborate production, but in Sarah's apartment while they were decorating a small Christmas tree Ruth had insisted Sarah needed. He was untangling lights when he suddenly stopped, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a simple gold ring. "Sarah Elizabeth Hartford," he said, still holding the string of lights in his other hand, "I love you. I love your brilliance and your stubbornness and the way you hum when you're thinking. I love that you call me out when I'm wrong and celebrate with me when I'm right. I love every scar, every fear, every moment of courage. Will you marry me?" Sarah looked at this man who'd helped her rebuild her life, who'd never asked her to be anything but exactly who she was. "Yes," she said. "But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me we'll be partners, really partners, equal in every way. No pedestals, no pretending, just two people choosing each other every day." "I promise," James said. "And one more thing from me. Promise me you'll never stop being exactly who you are. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me you'll protect that brilliant, stubborn, beautiful self even if it means disappointing people. I promise, Sarah whispered, and meant it with every cell in her body. They married in February 2022 in a simple courthouse ceremony with Ruth, James's mother, and their research team in attendance. Sarah wore a white dress from a department store, not a designer gown. James wore his father's suit, altered to fit. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising partnership and honesty and the courage to keep choosing each other even when it was difficult. The honeymoon was a week in the same mountain cabin where Sarah and Richard had spent their honeymoon years before. Sarah had suggested it, wanting to replace the painful memories with beautiful ones. James had been hesitant, worried it would hurt her, but Sarah was insistent. I need to take that place back, she explained. I need to prove to myself that Richard doesn't get to own every piece of my history. That cabin is just a cabin. It's the people inside it that give it meaning. That week in the mountains, Sarah felt pieces of herself knit back together. She and James hiked during the days, cooked together in the evenings, talked about their dreams for the future. On their last night, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, James took her hand. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Free," Sarah said, and realized it was true. "For the first time in years, I feel free." In June 2022, Sarah started feeling unusually tired, nauseous in the mornings, unable to focus on work with her usual intensity. She dismissed it as stress from the research, which was approaching a critical phase. But when the symptoms persisted for 3 weeks, James insisted she see a doctor. Dr. Patricia Chen, the same fertility specialist who'd treated Sarah during her marriage to Richard, smiled when she delivered the news. "Sarah, you're pregnant, about 8 weeks along. Congratulations." Sarah sat in the examination room, unable to process the words. "That's not possible. We weren't even trying." "Very possible," Dr. Chen said warmly. "Your fertility was never compromised long-term. The medications are completely out of your system now. Your body is working exactly as it should." Sarah called James from the parking lot, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. "James, I'm pregnant." There was a pause, then she heard him crying. "I'm coming to you. Don't move. I'm coming right now." He arrived 15 minutes later, pulled her into his arms in the parking lot and wept against her shoulder. "We're having a baby," he kept saying. "We're having a baby." At the 8-week ultrasound, Dr. Chen's expression shifted from routine to surprised. "Sarah, James, I need you to look at this." She turned the screen toward them. "These are 4 separate gestational sacs, 4 heartbeats. You're having quadruplets." Sarah stared at the screen, at 4 tiny flickering hearts, and started laughing through her tears. "4? 4 babies?" "Extremely rare to conceive quadruplets naturally," Dr. Chen said. "Sarah, your body is making up for lost time." James was holding Sarah's hand so tightly she thought her fingers might break, but she didn't care. "4 children," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to need a bigger house." "There's something else," Dr. Chen said, her expression serious. "Sarah, we found some abnormal cells in your ovary during the ultrasound, precancerous. We need to monitor them closely. But here's the remarkable thing. Pregnancy hormones are suppressing them. These babies aren't just your children. They're quite literally saving your life." Sarah pressed her hand to her still, flat stomach, feeling the weight of 4 lives growing inside her, 4 hearts beating in rhythm with her own. She thought about her father, about the promise she'd made at his funeral, about the years of pain and loss and rebuilding. And she thought about these 4 children who would grow up knowing their mother had fought for them before they were even born, had refused to stay broken, had chosen to believe in second chances. "Thank you," she whispered to them. "Thank you for choosing me." If you've ever felt like life gave you a second chance when you thought all chances were gone, you know the profound gratitude Sarah felt holding that ultrasound picture. 4 tiny hearts beating where doctors once said there would be none. 4 miracles growing where poison had tried to create only emptiness. This wasn't just about having children after years of heartbreak. This was about a woman who'd been told she was broken, discovering she was whole all along. It was about a body that had been attacked, finding its way back to strength. It was about choosing to live when giving up would have been easier and being rewarded with more abundance than she'd ever dared to dream. Sarah's story reminds us that our darkest chapters don't write our endings, that the people who tried to diminish us don't get the final word. That sometimes we have to lose everything to discover what we're truly made of, and that the family we build after devastation can be more beautiful than anything we lost. Real happiness isn't the absence of pain. It's the courage to rebuild after the storm, to trust again after betrayal, and to believe we deserve love even when the world tried to convince us otherwise. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized your body or spirit was stronger than you'd been told? What helped you find the courage to start over when everything seemed lost? Share your story in the comments below because your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.